Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. So today we're tackling something that I think is on all of our minds these days.
Let me guess. Social media.
You got it. Specifically, this whole idea of whether social media makes us look fake. We're going to be looking at a YouTube video by Andrew A.J. Johnson titled, Does Your Social Media Make You Look Fake?
Oh, yeah, I've seen that one. He makes some really interesting points.
He does. So let's jump right in. One of the first things Johnson talks about is self-censorship. Like, have you ever felt like you couldn't truly be yourself online?
All the time. It's like you're always second guessing yourself, thinking, will people judge me for this? Or will this make me look bad?
Right. And Johnson argues that this constant self-filtering, even if it's unintentional, can make us seem less authentic.
It's almost like we're all trying to present this perfect, curated version of ourselves. But is that really who we are?
That's a great question. It's like we're all living in this giant panopticon, like someone's always watching and judging.
Oh, I like that analogy. The panopticon. And it leads perfectly into Johnson's next point, the social image trap. It's that whole keeping up with the Joneses thing, but in the digital age.
Oh, totally. Those picture-perfect Instagram feeds, the amazing vacation photos, the seemingly perfect lives. It can make you feel like you need to present this flawless image, which ironically can end up making you seem less authentic.
Exactly. It's like trying to fit into a mold that doesn't quite match who you really are.
And that pressure to present a certain image can also really mess with our sense of self-worth, which Johnson talks a lot about too.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers game, the likes, the comments, the followers.
But Johnson reminds us that true value comes from within, not from external validation. He even contrasts this with like old school celebrities who were admired for their talent and accomplishments, not for their follower count. Such a good point.
Right. It makes you think how much of our self-worth is actually tied to those little red notification bubbles.
So much, probably. It can be a really slippery slope. Speaking of slippery slopes, Johnson also talks about how social media's format is affecting our attention spans. He even does this hilarious bit where he's like, imitates someone with darting eyes.
He's so funny, but he's also got a point. That constant bombardment of information, the endless scrolling, the bite-sized content, it's all contributing to our dwindling attention spans.
It really does make you wonder if we're rewiring our brains to crave instant gratification.
Definitely. And what does that mean for our ability to have those deeper, more meaningful interactions?
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Johnson talks about this paradox of wanting authenticity, but also fearing it. He even shares a story about revealing something personal online and getting a mixed reaction, which is so relatable.
Isn't it? We want to be seen and understood, but we also don't want to be judged or rejected. It's a tricky balance.
For sure. So how do we navigate that, right? How do we find that sweet spot between openness and self-preservation,
Ah.
especially online?
Tough question. There's no easy answer, I don't think. But by just acknowledging this tension, we can start making more conscious choices about how we present ourselves online.
Being more mindful,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And speaking of mindfulness, Johnson also talks about privacy, or the lack thereof, in the digital age. He paints this crazy scenario of someone in an old age home still having to explain themselves based on something they posted decades earlier. I mean, wild, right?
It's funny, but also a little terrifying. Makes you think, is anything truly private anymore? And what are the consequences of living in a world where our digital footprints can follow us forever?
Big questions. Definitely food for thought. Yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff to think about. And speaking of heavy stuff, Johnson also dives into this whole shame and humiliation culture that seems to be everywhere online.
Yeah, it's like this constant threat of backlash. It can make you feel like you have to walk on eggshells all the time.
Totally. So we're censoring ourselves and worrying about getting attacked. It's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
I know. And Johnson actually uses this word, what was it, performative, to describe what's happening. Like, in a way, we're all putting on a show for our online audience, performing this idealized version of ourselves.
Like a vicious cycle,
Yeah.
right? We see other people presenting these seemingly perfect lives,
Yeah.
and then we feel pressure to do the same.
Exactly. And all that comparing ourselves to others can be so damaging to our self-esteem.
It's ironic, though, because Johnson points out that it's this constant striving for external validation that actually makes us seem less authentic.
It's like the more we try to project a certain image, the further we get from our true selves.
You can see this happening in the types of content that go viral, right?
It does
Often the
exist.
stuff that's the most polished, the most carefully staged, the most attention-grabbing.
Right, like
Yeah.
where are all those spontaneous, genuine moments of connection, those messy, imperfect, but real interactions?
It seems like those get lost in the shuffle.
So,
Where do we go from here? What's the solution?
yeah. Well, Johnson talks about being more mindful, being aware of our motivations when we share things online. Like, why are we really posting this? What are we hoping to get out of it?
Being more intentional about the connections we're seeking. It's not about quitting social media altogether, but about using it in a way that feels more authentic, I guess.
You got it. It's about not letting algorithms control our self-worth or our interactions.
It's about remembering that social media is just a tool, right?
Yeah.
And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
So true. And Johnson also talks about how social media can make us feel like we're never good enough.
Oh, totally. There's always someone out there who seems to be doing better than us, having more fun, being more
Now,
successful.
it's easy to get sucked into that comparison trap and
Mhm.
start feeling inadequate.
But you know what? Johnson reminds us that everyone's journey is different.
Yeah, and that we shouldn't compare our behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel.
Such a good point. It's like we're all just trying to figure things out as we go.
We are. And that's okay. It's part of being human.
It is. It's about embracing the imperfections, the messiness, the realness of life.
Exactly. And, Johnson also talks about the importance of finding balance.
Oh, yeah. Like finding a healthy balance between our online and offline lives.
It's so easy to get sucked into the digital world and forget to nurture our real-world relationships.
It's true. Like we need to make time for face-to-face interactions, for experiences that don't involve a screen.
Yes. Go for a walk in nature, have a coffee with a friend, read a book, anything that helps you disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with yourself.
So important. I think we could all use a little more of that.
Totally. And Johnson also makes this interesting point about how social media can sometimes make us feel like we're performing all the time.
Like we're always on, always having to be entertaining or witty or insightful.
Yeah, it can be exhausting.
It can. And it can make it hard to just be ourselves, to
Yeah.
relax and let our guard down.
I totally get that. It's like we're always trying to present this perfect, polished version of ourselves to the world.
And sometimes that can get in the way of real connection.
For sure. But you know what? Johnson reminds us that it's okay to be vulnerable, to be imperfect, to be messy.
Yeah. Like that's what makes us human.
It does. And it's what makes us relatable to others.
So true. One of the things I really appreciate about Johnson's video is that he doesn't shy away from sharing his own struggles with social media.
Oh, yeah. He's super open and honest about his own experiences.
And that makes him so relatable. Like he's not pretending to have all the answers.
He's just figuring things out as he goes, like the rest of us.
Exactly. And, he also talks about how social media can sometimes make him feel really lonely.
It's weird, right? Like you're surrounded by all these people online, but you can still feel totally isolated.
Yeah. And I think it's because those online connections can sometimes feel really superficial.
They can. It's like you're just skimming the surface. You're not really getting to know people on a deeper level.
And that can leave you feeling empty and unfulfilled, even if you have thousands of followers.
So true. So what's the answer? How do we find genuine connection in a world that's so dominated by social media?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And, Johnson talks about the importance of being intentional about the connections we make online.
Like seeking out people who share our interests, who challenge us to think differently, who make us feel seen and heard.
And being willing to put ourselves out there,
Yeah.
to be vulnerable, to share our stories, to engage in meaningful conversations.
Yes. It's about being present, being authentic, being ourselves.
And it's about remembering that true connection takes time and effort, both online and offline.
Exactly. And that it's worth it. Because at the end of the day, we all crave that feeling of belonging, of being part of something bigger than ourselves.
So true. One thing that really struck me about Johnson's video was his discussion of how social media can distort our perception of reality.
Oh, yeah. It's like we're constantly bombarded with these carefully curated images and stories, and it's easy to forget that they don't always reflect the whole truth.
It's like everyone's always putting their best foot forward online. And it can make it hard to remember that everyone has struggles, everyone has insecurities, everyone has bad days.
Exactly. It's like we're all trying to keep up with this impossible standard of perfection, and it's exhausting.
It is. And it can make us feel like we're not good enough, like we're falling behind.
Yeah, it's important to remember that social media is just a snapshot, a curated version of reality.
It's not the whole picture.
And it's definitely not a reflection of our worth as human beings.
Absolutely. We're so much more than our online profiles.
So much more.
So we've talked a lot about the problems with social media, but what about solutions? Like, how can we actually use social media to cultivate authenticity instead of just performing?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, like
Yeah.
just recognizing how these platforms can influence our behavior and our thinking.
That makes sense. So instead of comparing ourselves to others, we should be focusing on sharing what feels true to us, right?
Exactly what resonates with our own values.
Hmm.
And building genuine connections with people who get us.
So it's about being more intentional, right?
Totally. And remembering that we have a choice. We don't have to play the comparison game. We can choose to step back, take a breath, and ask ourselves, why am I really posting this?
That's a good question to ask. It's like, what kind of energy do I want to put out into the world?
Right. Do I want to contribute to the noise, or do I want to offer something real, something that comes from the heart?
That's deep. Okay, so we've got awareness and intentionality. What else?
Well, I think it's also important to remember that social media is just one part of our lives. It's not the whole picture.
Yeah, it's easy to get sucked in and forget that there's a whole world out there beyond the screen.
Absolutely. And real connections to be made,
Yeah.
real experiences to be had.
Real life, basically.
Exactly. So make time for the things that light you up offline too. Spend time with loved ones. Pursue your passions. Get out in nature.
Things that make you feel truly alive.
Yes. And those experiences will inevitably make their way into your online presence in a more authentic way.
Because you're living a life you're excited about.
Exactly. So yeah, social media can be tricky. It presents all sorts of challenges, but it also offers opportunities.
To connect, to share, to inspire.
And ultimately, it's up to us to decide how we want to use it, to be mindful, to be intentional, and to, stay true to ourselves.
That's a great takeaway. Be mindful, be intentional, be yourself. Couldn't have said it better myself. So I think that about wraps it up for this deep dive.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground today.
We did. Big thanks to Andrew A.J. Johnson for sparking this whole conversation. And a huge thank you to you, of course, for sharing your insights.
Always a pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of social media and authenticity. Until next time, stay curious and keep it real.